In 2009, Nepal counted 121 wild tigers. That was the official figure from the country's national survey, and it represented one of the lowest recorded totals in the documented history of tigers in the Himalayan foothills. The forests that had once held thousands of Bengal tigers across the Indian subcontinent had been reduced through a century of hunting, habitat destruction, and prey depletion to scattered pockets of animals confined to protected reserves. Nepal's share of those animals was already small. At 121, it was smaller still. The Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation released the number, conservation organizations noted it, and the international community added it to a ledger of mounting losses across tiger range nations. What came next, across the following 16 years, would become one of the most closely studied wildlife recovery stories in Asia. In November 2010, 13 tiger range nations convened in St. Petersburg, Russia, for the Global Tiger Summit. The meeting produced a commitment called TX2, a formal pledge to double the world's wild tiger population by 2022. It was an ambitious target. Most wildlife biologists at the time considered it achievable in theory and unlikely in practice across the full range of countries involved. The global wild tiger count at that moment sat at roughly 3,200 animals, distributed across fragmented forests from Russia's Far East to the jungles of Sumatra. Nepal signed on. The country's 121 tiger baseline meant doubling required, reaching at least 242 animals within 12 years. Nobody knew at the time that Nepal would not simply meet that threshold. It would surpass it by a wide margin, and it would do so 4 years before the deadline. By 2013, the first national resurvey returned a count of 198 tigers. That was a 64% increase from the 2009 baseline in 4 years. The next census, conducted in 2018, pushed the number to 235. Then came 355 in 2022. Nepal had cleared the TX2 doubling target ahead of schedule, and the international response was immediate. India, Russia, and Bangladesh issued formal statements. WWF released a global bulletin. Conservation biologists who had spent careers charting the collapse of large carnivore populations began citing Nepal as a functioning counterexample to the dominant trend. The trajectory was real. It was sustained across 3 consecutive census cycles, and it showed no sign of plateauing. On July 29, 2026, Nepal's government announced the results of its 5th National Tiger and Prey Base Survey. The wild tiger population had reached 429. That figure represented a roughly 4-fold increase from the 2009 baseline across 17 years. It placed Nepal 4th in the world among tiger range nations, behind India, Russia, and Indonesia in the most recent global estimates, and some analysts noted it placed Nepal in striking distance of surpassing Indonesia altogether in the following cycle. The announcement came on Global Tiger Day, the 17th time that date had been marked internationally, and it arrived with a specific weight, not only as a conservation milestone, but as a data point that immediately raised a new set of questions about what happens when a recovery effort succeeds beyond what the landscape was originally calculated to support. The 5th survey ran from December 2025 through April 2026. The methodology was built around camera traps, approximately 3,696 of them, installed across thousands of grid cells in and around 5 protected areas. Because every tiger carries a unique stripe pattern, the same way a human fingerprint is unique to one individual, animals could be identified from photographs and counted without the need for physical recapture or handling. Around 1,900 camera positions were used across the survey footprint. The effort was led by the Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation, in coordination with the Department of Forests and Soil Conservation, provincial governments, and the Nepal Army. Conservation partners contributed personnel and technical support throughout the field period. The census runs on a 4-year cycle and is designed to track not just tiger numbers, but prey species populations and habitat conditions across the same geographic footprint. The population breakdown by protected area showed significant variation in how the growth was distributed. Chitwan National Park held the largest single count at 145, up from previous surveys and representing the park's highest recorded total. Bardia National Park followed at 112, though that figure was a decline from the 125 recorded in 2022. Parsa National Park registered the most dramatic single park increase, climbing from 41 tigers in 2022 to 71. Bangkay National Park rose from 25 to 51. Shuklaphanta went from 36 to 50. 4 of the 5 parks increased, 1 declined. The drop in Bardia was notable precisely because Bardia had historically been one of the program's most visible success stories. a landscape where tiger density had served as evidence that recovery could extend beyond Chitwan's well-managed and heavily studied core zone. The Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation attributed the sustained population increase across the 16-year arc to 4 factors: consistent habitat protection inside the parks, effective anti-poaching enforcement, recovery of prey species including spotted deer and wild boar, and transboundary cooperation with Indian park authorities managing adjoining forests along the southern border. Nepal's forest cover figures tell part of the underlying story. A World Bank analysis documented that Nepal increased its forested land area from 29% of national territory in 1994 to more than 46% in 2022. More forest meant more prey. More prey meant more territory capable of sustaining breeding tigers. Army units stationed inside and around the protected areas maintained continuous patrol pressure that kept organized poaching networks from operating at scale. Confiscation records showed a measurable decline in tiger parts moving through regional trafficking routes across the same period. The India coordination piece mattered in ways the raw census numbers do not immediately make visible. Nepal's 5 protected areas do not function as isolated islands. They connect through forest corridors to a chain of Indian reserves along the shared southern border, including Valmiki Tiger Reserve in Bihar and Katerniaghat Wildlife Sanctuary in Uttar Pradesh. Tigers move across those borders. Breeding pairs form across them. A female born in Chitwan may establish a territory partly inside Valmiki. A male from Bardia may range into Katerniaghat before returning. Both countries run coordinated patrol systems along the shared corridors. When anti-poaching enforcement weakens on one side, the animals on both sides absorb the consequences. The sustained operational cooperation between Nepal and India across the full recovery period was not incidental to the outcome. It was built into the management structure from the beginning. Globally, the wild tiger picture in 2026 looks different from what it did in 2010. The worldwide count has climbed from roughly 3,200 animals to an estimated 5,357. India holds the largest share at approximately 3,167 tigers. Russia maintains around 750. Nepal's 429 now positions it among the top tier of contributing nations. That global increase represents a genuine reversal of a decline that had been running continuously in the wrong direction for most of the previous century. At the start of the 20th century, between 100,000 and 200,000 wild tigers existed across Asia. By 1970, that number had fallen to roughly 4,000. By 2010, it had continued dropping to 3,200. The numbers since then have moved in the opposite direction for the first time in living memory. Then came the warning that arrived alongside the announcement. Conservation scientists monitoring Nepal's protected areas had estimated for years that the country's forests could sustainably support approximately 400 tigers. The 2026 census returned 429. Nepal's wild tiger population had exceeded the habitat's estimated carrying capacity. That 400 animal threshold is not a hard biological ceiling. It is a calculated figure based on observed prey availability, territorial requirements, and the behavior of tiger populations in ecologically comparable landscapes. Crossing it raised a specific and practical set of concerns. What happens when a tiger population grows beyond what the available habitat can distribute across non-overlapping territories without forcing an increasing number of animals into sustained contact with human settlements at the forest edge? Human-tiger conflict in Nepal had been increasing before the 2026 announcement was made. Bardia district alone recorded 53 deaths from wildlife encounters across the 5 years preceding the survey. In 2026, 4 people died in Bardia within a single month. Communities near the reserve boundaries described feeling caught between conservation policies they had little institutional voice in shaping and an expanding predator population they were expected to tolerate without adequate support or compensation. Wildlife researcher Babu Ramlamichane, who has spent years studying tiger ecology in Nepal's Terai lowlands, documented in a 2017 study that transient tigers displaced from established territories by competition, along with older or injured individuals, no longer capable of effectively hunting wild prey, are significantly more likely to enter villages, target livestock, and, in the most extreme cases, attack people. The communities absorbing the heaviest costs of that conflict were not distributed randomly. Rural settlements in the buffer zones surrounding Chitwan and Bardia, and particularly women performing subsistence tasks at the forest edge, faced the most concentrated exposure. A demographic pattern tied to large-scale male labor migration abroad. described in development literature as the feminization of agriculture, had shifted the burden of daily subsistence work almost entirely onto women in many forest-adjacent villages. Collecting firewood, cutting fodder grass, and grazing livestock near forest boundaries placed those women in direct proximity to tigers on a daily basis. Women made up less than 15% of the national park workforce. They were severely underrepresented in the institutions that shaped conservation policy, and consistently overrepresented among those absorbing the direct physical consequences. Benita Pariar, a 17-year-old from a Dalit family in Bardia, was killed by a tiger in December 2025 while cutting grass in the forest for her family's livestock. Nepal's government had begun formulating policy responses to the conflict problem before the 2026 census results were released. The 2023 to 2032 Tiger Conservation Action Plan outlined a set of targeted interventions, including improved livestock management protocols, compensation, and insurance mechanisms for families who lost animals or people to tiger attacks, rapid response units deployed to active conflict zones, and site-specific action plans developed from local data rather than national averages. The government also announced plans for what it described as Nepal's first tiger sanctuary, a facility proposed for approximately 52 hectares of land at Devnagar in Chitwan district. The sanctuary was designed to hold 18 to 20 animals, specifically individuals removed from the wild due to repeated conflict behavior. The facility was also intended to function as an ecotourism destination, generating revenue that could be directed back towards surrounding communities. Bhagawan Dahal, Nepal's country representative for the Zoological Society of London, stated that habitat management would become the defining challenge of the programme's next phase. Research consistently showed that tigers with access to well-maintained habitat, areas with adequate prey density and intact territorial structure, were significantly less likely to exit those areas and move into zones of sustained human activity. Dilbahadur Pun, Chief Conservation Officer at Chitwan National Park, said future programs would focus on sustaining the growing population through better habitat management and closer operational cooperation with communities living adjacent to the park boundaries. Chiranjeevi Pokharel of the National Trust for Nature Conservation described the current moment as one requiring tiger conservation to be approached simultaneously from ecological, social, and economic directions, rather than through population numbers alone. Wildlife researcher Baburam Lamichane, speaking to Nepal's broader international standing, noted that the increase in tiger numbers had become one of the country's most visible environmental credentials globally. Garna Sham Gurung described the result as a collective conservation achievement, one that reflected government leadership, community stewardship, and coordination across conservation partners sustained over multiple decades and multiple government administrations. The methodology Nepal developed, combining army-enforced protection inside park boundaries with prey species recovery programs, forest expansion, and transboundary management agreements, drew sustained interest from conservation managers in other tiger range countries who were searching for frameworks that had demonstrated measurable results at national scale. What the 429 figure represents, taken in full context, is not a simple success story. It is not a simple crisis story either. A species that had been declining globally for most of a century reversed that decline in a country that committed institutional resources, army deployments, forest policy, and transnational agreements to the reversal over 17 consecutive years. The forests expanded, the prey recovered, the poaching networks were suppressed, the corridors connecting Nepal's reserves to India's reserves continued to function. Those outcomes are real, and they are documented across 5 consecutive national surveys. At the same time, the population has now pressed against the estimated boundaries of what the available habitat can hold without increasing the rate of contact between tigers and the rural communities that have lived alongside those boundaries throughout the entire recovery. The 6th National Tiger Survey is scheduled for 2030. By that point, the tiger sanctuary at Devnagar is expected to be operational. The transboundary coordination agreements with India will be up for renewal and likely revision given the changed population dynamics on the Nepal side of the border. The conflict mitigation programs outlined in the 2023 to 2032 Action Plan will have been running long enough to generate outcome data. Whether Nepal's population stabilizes near its carrying capacity estimate, continues growing past it, or begins to flatten as territorial pressure redistributes animals across the available landscape, the next census will begin to provide the answer.